Hello out there, and welcome to the No Shit Cast. I'm your host, Matt Frazier. Woo, real exciting show today, baby. On the phone with me, Mr. Shifu Careaga, and a guest that he's brought me, a gentleman named Eric Wilson. I'm real excited about this, folks. If anybody's, if you've been listening to the show and know anything about me, one of the things I'm super geeked out about, and I'm always doing research and talking about, is things like power. And how big a deal power is going to be, in our society and world societies and things like that moving forward. And Shifu listened, and as usual, he goes out and finds me awesome guests. But this also happens to be a subject matter that he's pretty passionate about as well. So we got together today and thought we would do this show and kind of talk about power and what it means to society and different sources of it and things like that. So Shifu, thanks for being on the show again, bud. How you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. I was demotivated last night and today, although I still went and wrote a paper, but I'm feeling physically good. And how are you guys this morning?
Oh, good. So you brought us a guest, Mr. Eric Wilson. So kind of tell us a little bit about our guest for the show today.
Eric is a friend of mine I met, I guess it was last year or the year before. So what happened was, I'm a member of the Ancient Kentucky Historical Association, which people should consider joining. It's a great endeavor. You had Rick on, and he's a member, and he often presents there. But what had happened was Chris Dunn from the Giza power plant came to give a presentation on The Lost Technologies of Ancient Egypt, which is a fantastic book. It keeps coming up, all the symmetric, carved, powered tools of the ancients. And Eric was there, and it was interesting. So before that, the year before, I had met Chris, and I said, "Hey, let's talk about plasma." And he said, "Read my book, and if you still want to talk about plasma, And he was kind of joking. And so I read his book, and I was like, I still want to talk to him about the electric universe, And then, but then he shows up, and in the meantime, he had met Eric, and they had become friends. And so I was telling Eric, we like kind of sat next to each other during the presentation, and I was telling him how glad I was that he was helping Chris to kind of join in this paradigm shifting that's going on. And it just kind of all fell into sync, and Eric and I just get along really well. He's a super awesome guy. He's an electrical engineer. And Eric, welcome on.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for inviting me, Matt. Ramon, thanks for the introduction. Very great.
Yeah, we've been batting 1,000 with guests from Shifu, so I really appreciate. I mean, pretty much I'm at the point now where he makes contact for me with somebody. I'm like, when do you just want to be on the show? I don't even bother because the quality of guests have been off the hook. So publicly, I just want to say that, Shifu. Thank you so much.
Oh, no problem. Hey, it's all them, right? I mean, these people are all the experts. I'm just continuously sifting through the data, but people like Eric they're not just everywhere. You gotta really keep track. And I've definitely like poked Eric all the time, like what's going on, what's the newest.
Right.
He's one of the coolest.
So, Eric, you're kind of uniquely qualified to sort of talk about power and stuff like that, right? Can you kind of walk us through a little bit of sort of your history?
I can give you some background. I went to Southern Illinois University for my undergraduate and made it to Purdue for my master's in technology. Right now I work for Rolls-Royce Corporation, aerospace controls. And I've been in electrical machines, and right now thermal management of electronics. My background that Ramon's talking about with Christopher Dunn, mostly it's been a incredible learning experience, seeing things that I never imagined to exist. We've always been taught that the pyramids were tombs, but in fact, and I've only studied this for about a year with Chris, I saw things in there, just like Chris saw evidence of machining. I looked into the system of the pyramid, and that's one thing where I noticed that it is an electrical machine. Maybe we can get into that, maybe not. A lot of my other work, we spoke earlier before the call started here, worked a little bit with directed energy weapons. I've got a few patents on that, some insight into what happens behind the scenes with that, and some misconceptions that we have. Maybe we can get into that. So,
well, we got plenty of time.
That's sort of my background.
We got plenty of time. I guess it's all just time permitting, right? How far down in the weeds we go, but and it's funny that you mentioned that. I kind of ran into that too, because I got to work on a project that DARPA was messing around with, and it got misconstrued into the pub. It was called the system was called ITER, and it was an external combustion engine. I was doing the controls for it, so I don't want to overstate my position here, right? But it was basically an autonomous device that could forage. It could run around in like a wooded area and pick up leaves and sticks and things like that, and digest them and burn them for a heat source that created rotary motion, blah blah blah, to run a generator. But it got misconstrued into the media that this thing was going to go out and kill people and then eat them. And it's so funny because it shows just such a lack of understanding of basic tenets of anything, in the sense that it's like, well, human beings don't burn real well, and they certainly, because they're wet, so they don't. There's nothing about this that makes a lot of sense, but I've heard it on several podcasts and stuff too, where they talk about this all. Well, there's these robots that are going to eat people, and I'm like, it's not going to eat people. That just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So yeah.
It's so funny because I think even there's an idea where, like, if you get into conspiracy theories, you have to get in far enough to where you're even questioning the people who are spouting out the conspiracy theories. Are they put in place by? Are they some kind of CIA disinformation op or a psyop or something like that? Because there's a whole lot of conspiracy theories that just make zero sense, and we need to focus on ones that actually have teeth. Because there are real conspiracies. I mean, that's what people do. They get together and see, and they do things, and they advance their own cause. Look at geoengineering. They're having open conferences. Harvard's putting out propositions. China is fully investing in spraying nickel, and people. You will still see people say, "Oh, chemtrailing isn't real." I'm going, what are you talking about? They are now. They've done the research. They're now at the point, like, let's talk about what we can do with it, and they're going forward. We don't have any say about it. So there are conspiracies worth our time, and then there's like crazy stuff that it's just tinfoil hat and people worrying about everything, and everything is the sky is falling, and that is not what we're here to do. We are here to talk about like some serious issues. I would call like a bottleneck or like kind of like we've been withheld from things, and some of that is people. We alluded to this in previous shows where people are just always going to worship the most far out teacher. I mean, quantum kind of spoiled us, because it was like, is your idea weird enough? In order to we went from quarks, which already can't be seen, all the way to strings, which will never be seen. If they even exist. So we're at this point where, like, we need some grounding or some reality is my feeling. And the electromagnetic and plasma cosmology, it has a concrete root. We talked about this in the chronology. It goes back before general relativity. Now, the official for both Big Bang and plasma cosmology are officially 1927, but they go back to the same time period. It's a really important time period between 1895 and 1911, where a lot happened, and how it was interpreted determined everything. And then after that, there was some even more, obviously the atomic power movement. It all changed really quickly. So I don't know where you want to go from there.
Well, I was going to say that, let's start with the power stuff, because I think that's a great segue. My experience, of course, we talked about this. I sort of come down more on the traditional side of, things like nuclear and third and fourth gen nuclear and fusion reactions, stuff like that. But in our conversations, there's more sources of power than just those necessarily, was kind of what you were hinting at, right? That there's other ways we can get access to cheap, affordable, renewable,
Yes.
abundant energy.
There's literally so much. If you were to quantify, do you remember that there was like that there was that emperor in Africa who had so much gold that he actually killed the world gold market? Have you heard about that guy?
Vaguely. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he was African warlord in Mauritania, and I forget his name, but he just had so much gold that his gold was showing up all around the old world, and was just bringing down the cost of gold. Well, imagine an energy glut that energy would be cheaper than air. It would be it's everywhere. We have access. You think about this. We use photovoltaics to pull out visible light. Visible light is one of the thinnest spectrums in the entire EMF spectrum. So why aren't we trying to soak up infrared? Why aren't we trying to soak up UV?
Yeah.
Why aren't we trying to soak up radio waves and recapturing the stuff that these antenna towers are putting out all the time? We're not, because somebody needs it to be scarce. Now, one of the laws of energy that I put in the Magnetic Universe paper was energy is very abundant, but it's relatively difficult to acquire. But we're at a point where, like humans, we can create a home that is a caloric desert, to where only a couple species can actually survive in that home, like house spiders and roaches and mice, and that's about it. But we can pull calories and energy that we need for survival out whenever we want. So why would it be true that we can't access the sea of charge? I mean, the ether is a sea of charge, and it's a space counter space interaction where there's a constant exchange of energy in and out of the visible universe. And this energy, this dynamic that exists, it's like a gradient, right? So it's going to be pressure dependent. But we exist in one of the most, I guess you would call it yang or male or light-filled portions, because we are in the midst of the solar wind, and the solar wind from our sun is extremely powerful. Each hot grain coming off the sun has been measured by satellites to be 4 to 5 volts per dust grain, and we're not talking dust like in your house, but like microscopic dust. So 4 to 5 volts each. So we have that, and then we have tidal energy, we have wave energy, we have geothermal, we have an ability to have more steel than we know what to do with. We don't do it. What we do is still, like dig up ground that could be used for building homes or farming or whatever, and then we burn trees and coal in order to generate the heat to refine that steel. And we could just harness the coupling between the Earth and the ionosphere, because the ionosphere is loaded with 100,000 amps, and there's no shortage of energy. This sea of charge is really like everything. It determines our mood. It determines. I mean, you can obviously do things in your mood. You can take something, or you could eat something, or you could watch something. You could have a joke with somebody. But if you were left sitting there on your own, what's going to kind of determine whether you are motivated to get up and go, or whether you are feeling depressed and need to sit, is the amount of charge that is flowing through your system and all around you. And yet here we are, and what Tesla said all the way 100 plus years ago now, he said burning oil and fossil fuels in general, right, is the most barbaric form, the most barbaric way of getting energy. They had a steam-powered solar plant in the 1880s that was shown off at the World's Fair, I think in France, and the guy was going to put it in the Saharan desert, which makes total sense to me, and it just never happened, because the oil industry was like, nope, we don't need that. And then when it came to World War I, they just used all of his metal for scrap part. He was dead, obviously, so they just used it all for scrap metal. And nobody's brought it up again.
Yeah.
We've got, let's say, the Stirling engine, right? The Stirling engine literally is free energy. It runs off of just temperature gradients.
Yeah,
they have them
temperature differential
in
engine.
submarines. Yep. Yes, they have them in submarines.
Oh, the guy up in...
I agree. I mean, there have been incredible discoveries, and the hard part is how do we capitalize on it? Even the people that make the discoveries are trying to figure out, okay, I've got this thing that's incredible, but how do I profit with it?
Yep.
And when you get out there and you try, then the larger oil industry and such, they have so much power over that they push you down. So
I'll tell you guys, Eric, I had this is kind of an interesting anecdote to what you guys are discussing, but I actually at one point in time had a company that I owned called Waste Heat Resources. And I had the license for for that same external combustion engine that I talked to you a little bit about with this eater project. But and so we were going out, and our purpose was to look at like flue gas type waste, because people don't realize that like in the production of steel and things like that, an enormous amount of energy is wasted in the sense that it just kind of goes out the flue stack and doesn't really do much work, but it sort of has to be there as a part of the process. So my consideration was, why don't we just capture that and turn that back into some sort of, in this case, it wouldn't necessarily be temperature differential like a Stirling engine is. It would be more traditional, heating a fluid into a gaseous state, using that fluid to manipulate a prime mover. That prime mover then creates rotary motion, and we get electricity. So it's very traditional, except that the operating fluid wouldn't necessarily be water, steam, for instance. It could be a gas.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have an example of that in some work that's being done at Purdue University Propulsion, Purdue Propulsion.
Yeah, that's a thermoacoustic engine. Okay, so
a reaction is set up with your phase changing, but that's happening at a certain frequency.
So there's all kinds of stuff out there, right, that people are trying and doing that has all kinds of interesting possibilities. But here was the thing that I ran into, because I was doing this at the same point when the federal government was handing out shitloads of money to people like Solyndra, and so they were, in air quotes, they were investing heavily into green energy. So I thought, well, hell, this is something that would be great for, it'd be green, it would be carbon, lowering carbon rates per kilowatt, all these kinds of things. It's a no-brainer. And when I actually started down the road of the process of trying to get involved in this and getting government subsidization and stuff like that, it very quickly dawned on me, unless your name was General Electric, you weren't getting any of that money. It just wasn't happening. And I use them specifically because of all of that money that was handed out, they received an enormous portion of it directly. But it was like, they had put out the government had put out this position that it was looking into green energy technologies and all this kind of stuff, but the net effect was not that at all. It was more like, let's hand billions of dollars to large corporations. That's sort of how it worked out.
It's funny that you bring up General Electric because, I'm reading Eric Dollar's work, and he's the one who, and I certainly want to come back to the power and energy and talk about the definitions and talk about the 4 dimensions too, and how he actually describes these. He's one of the few people that's actually gone back and done Tesla. That's why I shared the true secrets of electromagnetism, Tesla style there with you. But he tells the story of Steinmetz. Do you guys, I guess probably Eric, Matt, do you know who Charles Proteus Steinmetz is?
Nope, doesn't ring a bell. Nope.
Okay, well, most people don't, and that's the irony here, because Steinmetz was a little person, but what he managed to do is to stay relevant at a time when all these hugely important figures of electromagnetism and this fruiting of the efforts of the 1800s and the early classical electromagnetists was now becoming product. And Steinmetz was the head of GE Labs. And the way he positioned himself was he was just, when you think of Tesla, think of Steinmetz. They're equal in their both of their importance for our AC power network and in their genius. Steinmetz has like an 1,800-page masterpiece that no one reads, right? Because he's the guy who discovered hysteresis, and he was figuring out what was burning up these AC generators. So he positioned himself as the only person at GE who could handle these issues, and they literally paid for his life. He had a very happy life. He didn't die penniless and alone. He had a very happy life and a family and everything. And GE sort of backed him. And their research ended up, of course, being a huge part of the RF world and the creation of RCA. And that's what led to the story that Eric Dollard has to share about RCA, in which there is the same general story, where there are these players, like they're willing for you to do all this research, but then when a revolution starts happening in terms of the computing revolution, they come in and they just start trashing his lab, taking his stuff, and even throwing it over the cliffs. And he was busy looking into some of the early, the less known Farnsworth tubes. Farnsworth creating the vacuum tube and helping to create the television. Well, there were these tubes, and they were different. They weren't quite the same. And apparently no one makes anything like these. And he was discovering plasmoids. When you apply an electric field, he was getting plasmoids inside. So it was basically the same kind of stuff that Langmuir and Birkeland and even to a degree Hannes Alfvén was aware of, creating these plasmoids that looked like galaxies, but they were inside the tubes. And yet, as he's getting close to creating this basically wireless power transfer that's all based on the work of a different guy than Marconi, but a guy named Alexander, they come in and they trash his lab, and this happens like 6 times. It's like the first group of people that did it was his own parents, and then it just kept happening. People kept, either they would throw it away, or the National Park Service would kick him out of an area because the land had been donated back. And apparently even wrote a whole book and was helping the San Francisco Tesla Society. And then they ended up being a Livermore National Laboratory front, and they locked it away. And he actually, in his book, is asking people, well, it's whoever is compiling the book, but they're asking people to help, because this guy ends up like homeless and he's in a car. Now he's doing okay right now because he's got an internet following. But if he hadn't had the internet, he'd be a nobody again. Right? He would be just another kooky guy who had been working with the mystical level of electromagnetism, that kind of stuff where you see Tesla holding a bulb and the bulb is lighting itself.
Right.
That's the kind of work he was doing. And he's putting out these formulas that are algebraic, and they are very simple. He continued the process that Heaviside started of getting rid of complex calculus that obscures the real meaning of what's going on, and just gets to the engineering, just gets to the units. And it's so simple. It literally, my 9-year-old can and will actually study this form of electromagnetism, because it's so much more empowering, and it's so much simpler to understand. It's very straightforward. We're talking like, energy is work divided by time kind of stuff. So that you can actually define energy with what it is, rather than this space-time idea, which is, if you ever analyze the space-time concept, it is very, very bunk.
So
go ahead, Eric.
Your paper's going into a new definition of how we describe energy. Is that right?
Are you talking about Eric Dollar's paper or mine?
Your own paper.
Oh, yeah. So that's where it gets into. I want to work directly with this sea of charge. I think that it's absolutely necessary. When you have, like when Tesla was creating his wireless power transfer station, there weren't very many people, and not very many people who were using electrical devices. And now the expectation is people, they want their smartphone and they want it to charge wherever they're at. They want to be able to set it on their table or anywhere and for it to charge. And we can't really keep going with imagine after 5G, because 5G is going to fair dinkum fry people's brains, okay? If you go to 6G, what's going to happen? You're going to start cooking your eggs with it in the morning. So we can't keep doing electromagnetic waves, Maxwellian style, forever. We've got to look into telluric currents and into scalar magnetic waves or scalar electric waves, if they even exist, right? It's a mathematical construct, so we don't know. And we also certainly have to look at these Birkeland currents, because the Birkeland currents are much more efficient at transferring energy over distances. because they degrade by the square root of R instead of by R squared. So imagine having to burn a lot less coal. Even if we were burning coal, you still have to burn a lot less in order to transfer electricity that way.
Now you're talking about,
through a Birkeland current.
and a lot of people don't probably understand that, Shifu, about things like line loss and stuff like that, right? That could be overcome, so that you're making the existing way you do it even more efficient, right?
Right. See, with wires, we're lucky because it takes the 1 over R squared of the electric field and magnetic field and the gravitic field and turns it into a linear loss of 1 over R. But that's still not very good, because you think about how much of the electricity is really just being converted to heat. It's just warming bird feet. And
exactly.
that is not really the best use of all that resource. I mean, it's going to go away. And unless we're going to spend the money to dig, to create robots that dig for coal underneath the ocean, or if we're going to burn all the forests of Canada and Siberia in order to get tar sands, at some point we're going to need to rely on something a little bit better. And I think most people want clean air too, right? Beijing needs clean air, and Mexico City needs clean air. We've done a better job in America. The free market has caused us to reduce carbon just all of its own volition, but the rest of the world is not going that direction. I don't care about the carbon. I just care about the air quality. So we have to find a way to produce energy better, and we also need to transport it better, because what Tesla started, he didn't intend for that to be the end, and he was already working on these telluric currents. And here's the thing. He would walk into a meeting. If you read his autobiography, he tells you he would walk into the meeting with the government, and it would either be above their heads, or more likely they just didn't want to talk about it. Now, the question is, at first, did they not want to talk about it because of bankers and J.P. Morgan and Westinghouse, because they controlled the power grid? Or was it later in the 30s and 40s, they didn't want to talk about it because they had classified a lot of this stuff, like they had classified some of the work and were clearly moving in the direction of electrokinetics and electrogravitics, and they wanted to not kind of let the cat out of the bag.
Yeah,
I have no idea, because I wasn't present for those meetings. I know that the FBI has now released certain redacted portions of the notes that they took from him when he died, which tells me they probably kept the parts that were the best.
Yeah.
And certain of those documents, by the way, have been stolen from the Tesla Museum, probably by Russians. Everybody trying to figure out the secrets of this power. I mean, ever since the first amoeba ate the other amoeba, people have wanted cheap and free energy. The question is, why aren't we going forward with it when all the way back then? I mean, what Dollar's talking about are like crystal radios that were produced in the 10s, 20s, and 30s that needed basically no power.
Yeah, no battery. Right.
And were clearer than the ones that came afterwards in the 50s and 60s. And they had some kind of metal plate that was installed out in the ocean that was receiving the information from a remote station. And then you got Professor Mail recently. He's got his scalar magnetic device, and he's using Tesla coils, and he's transferring information. And I mean, and I haven't seen papers produced, and that's a problem in our cosmology, right? Not enough people producing papers, but I do intend to get a hold of one of his devices, because he's talking about transferring like chemotherapy information specifically into a cell wirelessly. So the person doesn't even take the chemical. They just transfer the information of the chemical into the cells. And all of this would rely on the same you could call it free energy. It's not 0 point, but it's using both the quantum world, quantum entanglement, and it's using potential different type of electromagnetic transfer, energy and power transfer. And it is apparently a lot less damaging to the DNA. Again, all that needs verifying, and that's what I'm kind of proposing that people start doing, is study the work of Tesla and Steinmetz and Heaviside, look at what Eric Dollar's put together, and including what Christopher Dunn and Eric Wilson are doing, and let's find a way to have a better paradigm.
So Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, right? But Chris Dunn he's an engineer,
yes.
and an author,
Machinist,
right?
yeah.
Machinist, okay. So, and sort of the thing that he's investigating here, and I'm he kind of gets lumped in the same way. What's his name? Robert Schoch gets lumped in, the geologist, with a group that sort of also believes in aliens and things like this. But really, what he's researching is whether or not the structures like the pyramid were being used to create power. Right? I mean, it's not necessarily that he's got. Go ahead.
I think Chris first went in with in his early work in Egypt and realizing and seeing stone cuts in the stone.
He talks about tool marks.
Evidence.
Right.
You know, being a machinist, he saw that. Well, I see that on parts I'm cutting in aluminum. I see that in the shop when I'm running different parts, and recognizing that, and then beginning to write on, well, this is how these stones were cut because I can see the arc of the saw and such as that. And people can realize that and relate to it. But then you get deeper into the study, and with his Giza power plant book, you get into, this is a system. This is a mechanism. There's resonance within. You get acoustic response, and then the idea of piezoelectricity in the king's chamber. And when I've only looked at this for 1 year, okay? And when I studied what Chris had done, and I looked around at other people's works, it immediately resonated with me. I see what's happening. In fact, went on his tour last year and came back and went to Purdue University and saw some similar work in thermoacoustic engines. And I can admit that I've taken some of the data that I have found in Egypt and applied it to my work, and I've had good results, and people are coming back and saying, where did you get what you're giving us? It's like you're savant. And I'm like, no, I'm just reading this old data, and it's working.
Yeah, it's working out, right?
Well, part of the suppression that we talk about, suppression of technology, is this stigma around such data. So I present that to people I work with, and they're like, holy shit, I believe it, but don't tell anyone where you got it from.
That's kind of what happened. That's what happened with me when I started looking at Chris Dunn's work, and it was like, wait a minute, okay, I've seen enough of these types of devices professionally that I went, wait, why are we just discounting these, like the traces of chemicals and the different stuff that he's finding? I'm like, okay, there's definitely, okay, at the very least, it's an incomplete story, and it bears research. Okay,
it is, and that was the incredible shock to me to go to Egypt and say, this hasn't been really discovered. This hasn't been. Someone hasn't already dove into this. There's actually work here for me that archaeologists haven't found.
Yeah, well, right, because they don't have the institutional knowledge. You're talking about geologists and archaeologists.
Exactly.
They're not looking for the possibility of there even being some sort of power or electrical type solution there, because they're thinking primitive people. Baghdad battery was as good as it got, right? They're not making the connections necessary. No pun intended.
And I want to debunk the idea, this conspiracy theory that it's been hidden. It's not like that at all. It's just, it's taken time for the right people to get together
to see the information,
study it together. Yeah. You're right. Each one having a piece of the puzzle. So that's where we're at.
Yeah, and that's kind of my position, Shifu, sort of to your point, is, conspiracy theories. It's not a conspiracy theory, though, for large, powerful entities and organizations to work on each other's behalf. That's just sort of how it works.
That's the modus operandi.
Yeah.
I mean, if I was an executive, and let's go all the way back to Morgan and Westinghouse and Edison, they had no incentive to go beyond what they had gone. They'd conquered the world, right? They and in fact at that time it hadn't even spread out everywhere. Now we're at a point where AC's everywhere. So then you go forward a little bit. Who at some point somebody didn't want more stuff discovered. That's probably just classification, and that's just where the United States government, they have an interest. Like when Project Sapphire started doing, when they went from Star in a Jar Phase 1 to here's a serious machine that is going to literally get to the temperatures of the sun, the U.S. government stopped in and said, hey, we need to know kind of what you're up to, because it needs to be safeguarded against people like terrorists, et cetera, getting a hold of it. That's just modus operandi. That's the kind of conspiracy. When we say conspiracy to hide it, that's what we're getting at. Not so much as like there's
like an evil cabal
following you around in Egypt. That's definitely not been the case. There's just been a lack of understanding. I mean, there's been no understanding of how Egypt worked since the flood, because the flood, if we want to know where all the tools went, the flood is what knocked them away. I mean, I've found the research on that and the high watermarks on the pyramid. That stuff is all gone. What's left are trace minerals and things that didn't get washed away and were buried in mud. The vast majority of all the great evidence is gone. There were probably lots of Baghdad batteries, probably not just one Baghdad battery. There was probably an entire culture. Now, did they have high lines and did they have cell phones and stuff? No, I don't think that. And I've never personally believed that the Atlanteans were as advanced as we imagine, like some kind of Disney cartoon,
anti-gravity and all that kind of stuff.
Probably, though, they were super advanced for the time that they were in, because they were looking. What happened was they saw what was happening in the sky, and they said, how can we replicate that? How can we tap into that power? They certainly did it with the sword. The most common weapon of the god was described as a sword, the second most being an arrow, or some other, kind of like a heavy, an abstract shape, like a trident or a vajra or something like that. But the sword or the arrow, and those became the weapons of the world. These lightning bolts, these thunderbolts that they saw, and also the arc discharge that they witnessed in the sky, the plasma shapes, whether they were thunderbirds or therianthropes up in the sky. Not that they couldn't have been on drugs. I'm just saying that it seems a little bit convenient that around the world everybody was drawing these therianthropes and centaurs and phoenixes and stuff like that up in the sky. What they saw, they then applied, and they applied it as best they could. I don't think anybody expects that we're going to find ancient vehicles, although there are those ancient alien hypotheses with the hieroglyphs that look like tanks and helicopters. I don't have an explanation for that, but I do know that there were.
They may find alien vehicles. I don't know. They may have already been found.
They may.
At the bottom of the ocean, right? Possible. There's that big controversial.
I think we call them alien, but I'd like to say it was just an earlier civilization, and it doesn't fit the timeline, and a lot of that information gets even destroyed if it doesn't fit the timeline.
Which iteration of humanity are we on this planet right now? Who knows?
Yeah,
right?
That's a good point. The Buddhists think that we are a lot smaller than we used to be. They have their legends of people being 100 feet, and that the way that it works in Buddhism is that there are these things called kalpas, which are, think of them like extremely long eons, and as they go up and down, we basically shrink and expand in size. That's the Buddhist idea. But again, there's no real data for that, right? All that we have data, really just going back now 30,000 years. They found new lands that are older than Clovis First in Texas. They've now found stuff that's definitely older than the Younger Dryas. So humans have been around for a long, long time. There are some carbon datings, 140,000 years of people doing civilized stuff, but there's nothing like the Great Pyramids. However, there is one possibility of development of that technology in the form of the Bosnian pyramids, because the Bosnian pyramids are dated 20 to 30,000 years, and there could have been a transfer of people or technology. The Bosnian pyramids are much different than the Great Pyramids. They are not electrical. They're not anything like that. They're just literally a mountain that's been shaped, and then they've applied proto-concrete, like a mudstone that they made by hand, and made some pathways and some tunnels, and bada bing, bada boom, there you've got a worship center. It appears that the difference with Giza is that it was a purposeful designing of something industrial. And the reason why it can't have been just a water wheel or a tomb or just a monument is that, A, for the monument, there's no evidence that there was anybody that was that egoic, because they didn't put their name on the thing, right? The one glyph they found is definitely a forgery. And then as far as a water wheel, no one needs something that size or that shape to create a water hydration system, right? We can just use water towers and standard water wheels. Probably the hydraulics in it were for flushing out dangerous chemicals into the riverbed and getting rid of them really quickly if they needed to. And then finally, there's never been evidence of any mummies or treasure ever that has never been found in any of those 3 pyramids. And so we know that there has to be a good reason for people to get together. Any project that size undertaken today would bankrupt any nation other than the United States. So how could a country back then afford it without a rebellion or something to stop it? When the emperor Huangdi, the Qin emperor, okay, when he created his pyramid, it was going to be bigger than the Great Pyramid. As soon as he died, all construction was abandoned, right? They did put him in. They put all the mercury in and everything, and there's some really fascinating work going on in mercury research and basically everlasting candles, by the way. But the outside, all gone. They stopped.
Back to the purpose of the pyramid and the feeling that I get, and one thing that Christopher Dunn did for me when we got there last year, it was in March, and we went and we saw the Great Pyramid from the outside the first day, and I'm like, Chris, I want to go in. No, not yet, son. It's like, what? We got to do the whole tour. And so we went around to all the temples, and when you go into the temples, you get the feeling, oh, this is a holy place, right? People were taught here. This is a holy place, and we go to all the temples, and then on the very last day of the trip, we come back to the Great Pyramid and go in, and Chris was like, so what do you feel here? I said, this is absolutely a machine. I mean, it feels like the plant where we test engines at Rolls-Royce. It does not feel like the other places. And when you break down the structure and when you break down the systems, they were making power for what? We don't know, but probably for the same reasons we were.
And you're saying you're not talking about feel in the woo sense of feel things. You're talking about, look.
I am.
Oh, you are?
No,
okay.
I'm talking about, if you go into a church, how do you feel? You feel different, right? Than if you go over to a factory or they're building something. It's a different feeling within yourself.
Right. They call it a vibe,
the
a feel.
Or the arrangement. Yeah, the arrangement of energy, the purpose for which it is designed is embedded in a kind of a biosphere that we are aware of. We're totally aware of. People come to this clinic, they want that kind of feeling. They don't want to feel like they're at the post office, right? That's just
sure.
And
totally
I can say I've had these feelings, right, from my own experience, because I work in such factories where we're running gas turbine engines. One of our power facilities has 15 engines that run our atmosphere. And when that is running and you're in that building, it's a huge building. The whole building is shaking. You can feel the power of the building and its purpose. And we're making atmosphere to test gas turbine engines. And it's not the same as going to a church where you feel calm and you're spiritually connecting with yourself. And it's a working system versus
well, that begs a question, and this is one of the things that popped up first time I saw Christopher Dunn on TV was, okay, I'm bought, man. I think that there's definitely more to this story, way more than we know. Okay, so consider me a customer, right? But my question would be, to what end? So what if they were making copious, enormous amounts of power? What were they using it for? Like, what was it doing, or was it?
Well,
go ahead.
Well, the question is, we need to find the substances that they were interested in. We need to have copious amounts of electrum, right? And we need to see how it interacts with the plasma waveform. And
we can speculate what they used it for. We're not exactly sure.
Yeah.
Another friend I have is Doug Keenan, who happens. It's an incredible thing. I live in Indianapolis. Chris Dunn's an hour away. I can go over and see Chris whenever I want. And then I just discovered, it's only been a few months ago, Doug Keenan. And he also wrote a book on the pyramid. And how is it that these people live so close to me? Doug's 15 minutes from my work, and I go over there often and we discuss. And one of his theories is the alignment of the pyramid. It's not an alignment with Orion. Yeah, it matches that shape, but it aligns every night to the path of the moon. The southern shaft, where Chris proposes that hydrogen maser was firing, or that's where it would discharge its energy out the southern shaft. You can read the book for details. The southern shaft is at 42 degrees, which is nominal to the path of the moon, which means they could have used the output of the pyramid, just like we do today, to bounce signals off the moon to where it'd be a relay system anywhere on the world or anywhere in the universe.
One idea that I was having about it, I mean, if it isn't just a way for them to have electric fields to carry around Crookes tubes and be holy, and there's no carbon charcoal like throughout the ceiling, so we know that they weren't burning copious amounts of fire inside this pyramid. But it's possible that they were using in this idea, this scheme that he's proposing, to get the moon to give back energy, because the moon is our closest body. I mean, if it wasn't just purely worshiping the moon or some other celestial body, maybe they were trying to induce an arc discharge, because there is this new research out. This is patented research, folks. You can find it on ResearchGate or anywhere on the web, really, where they're using lasers now to create plasma ion chambers between arc gaps. And I'm not kidding you, they're already, just at the infancy of this research, getting arc gap 400% the distance that it would if it had to break down the air itself. And it's following a straight line.
I've heard about this.
Straight line.
They're using lasers to transmit energy. Right. Okay, go ahead, Eric. Sorry.
Oh, I'm first hearing it from Ramon, but I know where you're going with it. You can, with directed energy weapon, you can produce a cylindrical path of light that ionizes the air in the path, and then you've got an electrical connection.
Oh, it becomes a conduit, doesn't it? It
pushes
through
like a conduit. Because the pyramid being big enough and also being resonant, because it is 1/24,000th the size of the Earth, being resonant with the Earth, it can then not only send this signal, but then receive the signal back and actually perform. It would be beautiful, obviously, but it would also be perhaps a way of mining back more energy than goes out. And after all, the moon is it's a little bit further out in our magnetosphere to where it would be receiving a lot more charge from the sun than we do. And I know this sounds like, folks, I realize that all sounds really, really way out there, but it is in line with what I see as the future of where we need to go. And on top of that, we have to still figure out what they were doing, because it just, to me, to say that they were just carrying around Crookes tubes, which there is a hieroglyph for, and Chris has in his book, to say they were carrying around Crookes tubes just so they could admire the one force, it doesn't seem like they would need to build one so big.
Explain that
and
for somebody.
They were building them bigger and bigger, because you get one small one and the next one, and then they finally have this really huge one, and it ran really well until there was an explosion. So
explain Crookes tubes. And I know what you're talking about, and I've heard that that's been actually described as what they were painting or drawing was the aroma. That was like they're showing you what smell, that there's an aroma from this flower or whatever. But
yeah, well, the hieroglyph in question is a funny one. Of course, the ancient alien people have their version, and the religious files have their version, and always, ever since they discovered that there was a lot of underworld speak in hieroglyphics, the obsession of the Victorians was to paint the death cult, and the whole world apparently is a death cult, nothing but a death cult to archaeology. But when you look at the actual hieroglyph, it looks like you've got this snake that's going in a sine wave. It's inside of this kind of bulbous tube that is basically the same shape as a vacuum tube. Crookes was just the guy who first invented them. And then you've also got the outstretched hands. Okay, now the upstretched hands on top of the set of toroids is a 100% verified plasma glyph. Okay, Peratt has put out the work and shown what that is, and you can read all about that in his paper. All this is on the EU Gateway, by the way. All this stuff that we have mentioned, you can just search and it comes right up. Okay, so there's no problem for people to find everything we're talking about. But this upstretched hands is also prevalent throughout all of their worship material. Okay, there's always this. Okay, so they've got the newt, and she's stretching out in kind of a band across the sky, right? And many people have interpreted that to be the Milky Way. And then you'll have another goddess, probably Isis, right? Or one of her other names. She has a lot of names. With her hand stretched up, and one hand actually touches the breast of Nut, and the other one is just out receiving. So what is it receiving, and what is it exchanging with? Now, the upstretched hands goes back to the ancient bull sign, the heavenly bull, and that goes back to the rotating crescent. And this crescent, by the way, is not the moon, because we have other glyphs that show the star inside of the crescent. You can't see that with the moon. B, many of the glyphs, the crescent is never that crescent shape is never to be seen on the moon, because the moon just won't form that shape. And C, these crescents have a pure description in the when they actually translate them. Okay, Egyptologists, the crescent will actually rotate at different times of the day, including one time at the bottom, and there will be another time at the top. So this rotating crescent, or this ship, is a motif. In my paper, The Dionysian Irony, I even have pictures of this motif currently in amusement park rides, like at Coney Island, or even at Cincinnati, at the Coney Island in Cincinnati. You'll see these motifs, and they are prevalent in our society even still, but we don't ever talk about them. And so the question is, what is this upstretched hands really about? Is it describing how at one time the power of the one God, and now we're receiving that power? Is it associated with the cosmos? Is Nut here still the Milky Way, or is it something else? Is it a band of plasma? We don't know, but it's in this glyph. And then, of course, there's a whole host of other things in the glyph that are fascinating. But it's very clear that hieroglyph has a lot of deeper meaning, and it can't possibly be about a flower or bees or anything of the sort. Something mundane that we reinterpret through our modern filter, because we don't want to imagine something more.
Yeah. I kind of have that fatalist sort of view too, with ancient structures and things like that, because you see those temples and things where the priests would get behind the statue and talk through a tube, kind of stuff, so it made it look like the statues were talking and things like that. So my mind always goes to, okay, so maybe they didn't really understand the physics per se, air quotes, physics of what they were doing, but okay, so what would be the means? So if you had these giant pyramids and they glowed, it would certainly imply to everybody that you or your nation had the power of God, given that nothing else does that. So I think it could be, I'm not discounting that it could be just as primitive as something like that. That it could be just that they had stumbled onto some kind of chemical process and some sort of sacred knowledge. Full disclosure. So I've seen these organizations, like I'm personally familiar with things like Masonry, as a Freemason and things. So I understand sort of at an intimate level how esoteric knowledge was protected, and then also sort of handed down through the actual, what the term is, the priesthood, right? So that sacred knowledge and things like that were passed down. So to me it could just be something as simple as, we came across this, it works, and it helps us to sort of keep a nation unified and all these kind of things. So it doesn't have to be
absolutely.
That they were running motors.
I don't know that it's that simple. From what I have seen, from being there, from looking at the technology, what it takes to cut those stones and they were very, very advanced, and for them to know exactly what they were doing with manipulation of sound and if you will say controlling people,
Yep.
I think they knew the art.
There was
knew
more
exactly
to
what
it.
they were doing.
Yeah.
It would be. If you think about between Bosnia and Giza, you have already at least 8,000 years, if not more, time. And then at Giza, you'd have several more thousands of years in order to develop this. I mean, with sound, yes, to the point, you can, like the Zhou dynasty, they rang bells to kind of create peace in the uh, universe. Like frequency can be used that way, and it would be worth worshiping.
Still big
It
part
would
of
be
Tibetan.
absolutely worth worshiping light, sound, the peace, the general abundance, because at that time, as when we're talking like, before the Younger Dryas period, up through maybe even 9,000 years ago, the Sahara was actually a big fertile plain, and there was a ton of water. The Nile itself was at a different level and in a different position. It went right up to the Sphinx pause. So it was a different kind of era, and there would have been a celebration of this power, and it's possibly related to this Atlantean story. Now, the priest who told Solon the story, he didn't say that it happened in our backyard and that we're the cause. He definitely said it was somewhere else. But perhaps they were an outpost. Maybe they were an extension of that culture. Maybe they were all over the place, and they were utilizing this kind of technology all over the place. Maybe they literally did cause, because in my paper, in the plasma glyphs paper, I propose that it's the moon that, because all these stories, whether there's Graham Hancock records in his book, Fingerprints of the Gods, they're from Native Americans in South America mostly. They propose that it was the moon that caused the first great flood, not the rains that were caused by a comet, but the actual what appears to be mega tsunamis. And you look at some of the research that's being done about the Eye of the Sahara, and when you look at the Google sat above the Rakat structure, there is a clear flow in of water from the Mediterranean and a flow out towards the Atlantic. So what was it that happened? Maybe this stuff was associated. They certainly, if they had access to Birkeland currents, they could have accidentally incited all sorts of things in our atmosphere. They could have been doing HARP and Large Hadron Collider kind of research. And as for this idea of it being physics, people have this idea that physicists must use math. But if you go and you actually look at the work of Volta and Maxwell and Faraday, these guys, when they first started, they weren't doing math. I mean, Tesla, he didn't use math in the beginning. He would visualize what it was, and then he would create it from that visualization. Math is a tool for describing. It's not a tool for inventing. So they could have been doing all sorts of physics and not, quote, really understood what it was, but still been extremely sophisticated. I mean, they were clearly engineers. Only teams of engineers could have built that pyramid. It wouldn't have been slaves. There would have been very shoddy work if it had been teams of slaves. There would have been lots of logistical problems. That we can see the kind of work that most pyramids and mounds were done around the world. The kind of engineering that we're talking about at the Great Pyramid is way too precise. Yeah. It's unnecessarily precise for a tomb or a water tower.
There's definitely sites that stand out as being remarkably better, air quotes, engineered. I got to quit saying that. But better engineered than others. Like the Indian mounds in Ohio and things like that seem much more primitive. You can tell, like when you look at places like Pumapunku or even Göbekli Tepe, which is, I love that place because that place is like a bomb in the accepted timelines of things. Like I love that place. Go ahead.
Well, it's so important to Göbekli Tepe, and it's so important that they don't want to. They went ahead and covered it, and they're not going to uncover anymore. Why? Because the oldest good stuff is at the bottom. They haven't even excavated.
Yeah, it's in layers, right? It goes down.
Yeah, they
layers.
did the top 20%, and they say, well, we've got enough. As soon as they uncover the oldest delay, and it goes back to the age of Leo, and of course, the original archaeologist, he died. So there's no impetus for them to keep going. Turned it into a tourist site. We've told the story. Wow, it's really amazing. Well, you haven't gotten to the amazing stuff yet. Let's get back to the part where it was pre Younger Dryas event. I mean, already it is telling a story of some type of catastrophe, but it's not in a language that we recognize.
Yeah.
So it is a little bit difficult there's going to be a lot of open interpretation. And of course, the ancient alien hypothesis, which you can't hardly get rid of because it's not really a scientific hypothesis. It's very difficult to disprove. So they're going to interpret it one way. The archaeologists, they just don't know what to do with it. And they do the same thing they do with all OOP arts. They just sit on it, or they put it in the back of the museum. Yeah. For example, you know, there were mummies in Kentucky and in Ohio, right?
Yeah.
So there's a mummy from Kentucky, and the name is Fawn Hoof. And she's kind of famous because most of the mummies that came out of Kentucky, they were exploited for local tourism. And some of them were burned up. Like there was one that was at the Barnum Bailey Circus. It was burned up. And so I actually went out and saw it, and I found somebody had reported where the mummy was supposed to be. And it was a heck of a time. I finally got a hold of the Smithsonian and verified, and yeah, they still have it. But it was basically, it's in a drawer somewhere, right? And it came out of a cave in Kentucky, and it's valuable data. It certainly should be on display here in Kentucky for Native Americans to show up and be connected with, but it's in a drawer, and that drawer is somewhere in a box, and it's just like that scene in Indiana Jones, right? And it's at the Smithsonian. I met a man named Greg Little. He wrote the book on the Encyclopedia of Earthworks and Mounds, and it's a really fantastic book. I think people should get it. Greg Little, and he told me straight up that what they didn't need, if it was giant bones or mummies, if they didn't need it, they went ahead and incinerated it because they couldn't.
I've heard that a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, they couldn't do anything else with it. They were out of room. They found so many of these bones and things that couldn't be explained, whether they were Welsh, red-haired giant women that were blonde. I mean, literally women that were like almost 7 feet tall, who were blonde and buried in armor.
And it even has a name. They call it out-of-place artifacts.
Yeah, yeah. And these OOP arts, they don't know what to do with them, so they just put them in the back. I mean, and if they really don't like the one that looks like a rocket ship, a guy had to go through extra effort to get the museum to display that over in Europe. If he hadn't been through that effort, that piece would have sat hidden away in a box because they don't like OOP arts, right? They barely they barely like the end of Clovis First. That is a real problem for them because Clovis First is it's not just mainstream, it's dogma, right? If you suggest that humans could have come over the sea, over the South Pacific to South America, that's considered anathema, let alone if you say what the Eastern Islanders say. The Eastern Islanders say that their island is the remains of a lost continent. And it appears to be actually just that, the lost continent of Mu. And now the research is showing that the oldest civilizations are South America, not North America, and that in the Cherokee and the mound builders in general are looking like they came up from the south. And of course, the culture shifted. Right, the Mississippians don't behave exactly like the Aztecs and the Mayans.
Yeah, well, this also happened
over a lot of similarity.
It happened over a long period of time. This isn't something that happened in a year or 10 years, right? Necessarily.
Well, think about like we're American, right? Our culture just a couple hundred years ago came from Britain. Look already how different our culture is from England. There are people. Have you ever tried to watch a movie from Australia? I tried to watch the Fast and Furious from Australia, and I literally couldn't understand what they were saying. And they were speaking English technically, but I couldn't understand what they were saying, and that is only a matter of decades. Imagine after 1,000 years, some of the central tenets of the religions will be the same, such as the building of pyramids and the worship of the cosmic mound of the sun. Some of the shapes, such as the hand with the spiral in the center, which you see at Moundville, Alabama. But a lot of things would change. And did change. And if the Welsh came here and they mixed with the locals and created a whole new culture, they would have changed quite a bit.
Yeah.
But in all those stories, one thing remains the same. Every time a Welsh Indian is encountered by a pioneer, they speak a little bit of the mother tongue, and they always tried to retain their Bible. They didn't understand what it meant, but they tried to retain their Bible. And these kinds of movements, I think, are the rule and not the exception.
Sure.
I think that it is really much more likely that people were always moving about looking for new calories and safe safe from their enemies, and it's very unlikely that the world suddenly was discovered all by the West. That's just nonsense. It doesn't make any sense to me. And there's already good research going on. We're showing the Chinese had been here and were probably the ones who first introduced smallpox to this continent, and not the Europeans.
Ramon, have you studied much about Cahokia, Egyptian presence?
Yeah, not about so much as an Egyptian presence, but again through the discussion about the Chinese and their interactions with the Cahokians that are contained in the book, the Chinese book, To the Gates of Fengtu. The Cahokians are rather mysterious because if they did come from Mayans, who then came from Olmecs, the question is where the Olmecs come from. And there is research showing about the connections to lots of different types of cultures, including the Shang, Chinese. But it is possible that the Egyptians could have been there. I mean, we have hieroglyphs in Australia that have they've been translated by Egyptologists, obviously alternative Egyptologists, not ones working for Zahi Hawass. And they tell the story. Now that those hieroglyphs themselves appear to be, from the newest dynasties and not from the most ancient dynasties, but it still goes to show. I mean, these boats were able to travel. Thor Heyerdahl showed that. He showed these boats were able to travel. You have wood from China, from the age of the Hulagu people of China. So there's like Vikings, but 7,000 years ago, that is being found on New Zealand beaches. So if there's people from China sailing down to New Zealand, why can't there be Egyptians sailing over across either the Atlantic or the Indian Ocean? All they'd have to do is follow the coast. As far as getting across the Atlantic, they would just need to basically take the southern route over to Brazil and then come up, and then for coming back, they follow the Gulf Stream halfway. It's not impossible to think about. Certainly the Chinese, they had a huge fleet, so the Chinese had an advantage. And there's no doubt that the Chinese did make this journey. When you read To the Gates of Fengtu, they describe Mecca. They have the entire interaction with Mecca. They even have a debate because they're Buddhists, right? So they meet these Muslims, and the Muslims, they're trying to convert the Muslims, and Muslims are trying to convert them. But they have a pleasant time, but it perfectly describes, it tells that it would take 3 months for them to get all the way around Africa and finally make it over to Arabia. So if the Chinese could do it with wooden boats and sails and oars, why couldn't Egyptians do it? Why couldn't Phoenicians do it? Why couldn't Welsh do it? It's unreasonable for us to imagine that somehow.
I look at the structures that are in Egypt and realize, well, if they had this technology, going around the world is simple.
Yes, I mean
that's a good point. That's a really good point.
Was using maps from other people, and he was using a boat with sails. So what is so amazing about Columbus doing it? And it's like, I mean, what he did was good for us, but it wasn't necessarily new. It had been done before.
Well, that's
in my opinion.
There's an interesting tie to exceptionalism in all of this stuff too, right? So, because I think at this point we kind of know that what we were taught in grade school about the history of the finding of the Americas and all that is kind of complete bullshit, right? That doesn't. But to the victors go the spoils of war, and the people that win write the history, and they have a tendency to make themselves look really good when they do that, right? So
well, then that leads us right to Einstein, and I hate to pick on the old man, but it has to be done. Do you know who Henri Poincaré is?
I've definitely heard the name.
Okay, well, that's good because he's the real guy who discovered relativity theory, and he's the real guy who postulated gravity waves.
That's right. That's why. I think you were the one that turned me on to him, actually.
Probably. So here's what happened. Henri Poincaré was not a physicist. He was not an electric guy. He was a mathematician. And he was friends with Lorentz, and so he was using Lorentzian transformations on Maxwell's equations because, as we've talked about before, they were difficult, right? This is pre-Heaviside, so they were really difficult equations to work with, and he got to the place where, you know, E equals mc squared. He rearranged it, right? He had m equals E over c squared, but it's the same thing, right? And he was now stuck at, I think they call it the 3-4 problem. You have 4 dimensions needed, and you have a 3-dimensional space. And he therefore said, well, I don't believe that I've done the work correctly, or it's not realistic, you know. And he, being into concrete things and against ridiculous ideas like miniature infinities and things like that, he set it aside. Well, Einstein did not, and he had done basically the same kind of work. Whether or not he stole it, or whether or not whatever, he put the paper out after. And he went ahead and then went from, you know, he got his Nobel Prize in the photoelectric effect. That's why he got famous. But he went from special relativity towards general relativity. And here's the key. In the time that he had done that, to creating an ether based on this space-time conglomerate, or just, you know, this hodgepodge, Poincare died. And so he wasn't there to contest the story. And many people did, the quantum people being among many. Of course, Einstein contested them. He famously said he didn't believe God played with dice. But no one was really there to provide a counterbalance of what could have happened. Well, here's what Eric Dollard has written in from his Tesla work. He says that the 4 dimensions are not the 3, like, you know, up X, Y, Z, and time, because space itself is a single dimension. It's literally, if you think about the concept of space, that's all it could be, is a single dimension, because the volume in it is multidimensional, right? Any kind of volume is going to be three-dimensional, but the space itself, as an abstract concept, really is only one dimension. So there were the 4 dimensions that he cites in his book, in which he uses to simplify these equations down to simple algebra, is space, time as 2 separate things, and then magnetism and dielectricity. And magnetism and dielectricity being based on space and counter space and their interaction. And he has a clever way of explaining it, both using, in another book of his, practical electrical engineering for the future. He describes the inductive effect of the electricity moving along versus the capacitive effect of the wires as they're spaced apart from each other. And he uses that to go forward with describing how the units actually work, and creating a situation where energy is related to how much work is being done versus you know, the potential, obviously, of sitting there. Because if you have potential energy, you can't really actually use it, right? It has to be converted for it to be useful. Otherwise, you wouldn't even know it was potential energy. It would just be like, if you lift a book up, it's not like it's glowing now.
Right, exactly.
It's said to have more potential energy. Well, it only has more potential energy if, once you release it, you see all that extra kinetic energy come back out.
Right.
So this is the space counter space issue. And this is the kind of magnetism that is also being described by the guy named Ken Wheeler. He does cite Dollard and Steinmetz and Tesla a lot. And one of the things that he says is really fascinates me, and I like to think about a lot, is if light is not a photon, which it most certainly can't be an actual particle. It can behave like a particle, it can behave like a wave, but it can't be those, right? Because it couldn't be both at the same time anyhow. And also, if you pass light through glass, it goes a third less the speed, and then once it leaves the glass, it instantly goes back the speed of light. Of course, in air, if we're doing it in the room, right? So how would it speed back up instantly? If it's a particle, that would violate.
Yeah, where did that energy come from?
Right, that would violate, and it would be instantaneous acceleration, which also can't happen. So the light can't be an actual particle. So what is it? Ken Wheeler is making the point that light is the rate of induction. That C is the rate of induction of the electric circuit. That it is a self-contained electric circuit that is propagating along. And you could see this. And they did those. Do you remember when they did those slowing light down experiments? and they photographed it. They had to create an entire new way of photographing in slow motion so they could actually do it. Did you remember that?
I don't.
Okay, well they released
I've
it.
seen that.
It's on TED. All right, now here's the key. When you watch it, they want you watching the center of the Coke bottle, and they for some reason they left the label on. I guess they claimed that they had no sponsorship, but I beg to differ. But
Yeah, bullshit.
so
Right.
right, exactly. So the light, you watch it, you're supposed to be watching it go in. Here's the thing that gets me. The light, okay, it's all in slow motion, right? The light is also reflecting off the table, but you don't see it leave the bottle and move in slow motion and hit the table and then bounce back up. So how is it following along on the table? If the light is being pulsed through the bottle, how are you seeing that in slow motion but not seeing it leave the bottle and go down and reflect off of the table and then come towards the camera? It's a convenient story. So they're saying, look at these photons traveling down the bottle in slow motion, but they're not explaining how is that field propagating off the table. It reminds me of the space-time, the common demonstration is to put a ball onto a fabric and say, oh, look, the star is weighing down the fabric of space-time.
Yep.
Well, tell me where up and down is in space. And how is it that the gravity, you're using Newtonian gravity as an analogy for space-time? It's a circular reasoning. It's a hand waving is what I'm getting at. And it's masking that real actual behavior. I'm not saying that it's a conspiracy to hide the nature of light. I'm saying that we're stuck in a series of beliefs about light and about electricity that we've inherited. And it is convenient that because we haven't overcome those limitations of paradigm or perspective, we haven't gone off to tackle the most important problem, which is how are we going to provide energy for everybody when we've got 8 billion to up to 11 billion people
Right.
that the projection is going to be.
Yep. And the energy demands of a modern society are significantly higher than those of a society even like 20, 30 years ago. It's amazing how much more energy per citizen we consume. And I wanted to ask a question because we were kind of talking about, we hit it a little bit about difference of potential. And that's what, where energy actually kind of hides is inside differences of potential. And Eric, I kind of wanted to ask you this. I mean, I guess it's accepted that if, like the chemical battery sort of hypothesis about the Great Pyramids and things like that, but we sort of always kind of look at it through the lens of it being electrical power. And that's not necessarily the case, right? It could have, because there's pressures and things that are involved here. And pressure is a way to store energy, is it not?
This is true. It's hard to step away from your training. You're an electrical engineer, and it's hard to think of energy in a different form. Yeah, they may have been harnessing like
hydraulically.
Ron says.
Couldn't they?
Well, there's hydraulics in there. There's something for everyone in the Great Pyramid. There's electrolysis of water. There's acoustic vibration. There's piezoelectric. There's thermal properties, and then how do you pull the electric? How do you pull the energy? There's a hydraulic. Yes, there's a John Cadman has details, and Doug Keenan supported that in his book for the hydraulic effect on the subterranean chamber. It was a hydraulic ram pump, 26,000 tons of force. That could have just been to get things started. It didn't need to operate continuously from what I've seen with thermoacoustic engines. You just need to hit them once and the reaction starts.
It's like ringing a bell. It rings, it resonates.
Yeah,
after that, right?
Once you get it ringing and then it goes into a exponential, and that's what we exploit with the thermoacoustic. We go into an exponential, it runs away. You're getting a what you would consider in a gas turbine engine catastrophic resonance, something you don't want. The pyramid actually goes there. It wants to create a exponential increase in energy, in vibration that today we wouldn't even go there.
Well, this isn't, and it's not a something from nothing hypothesis either, is it? I mean, there was maintenance and chemicals required to keep this process going.
Let's talk about those. Eric, will you explain how the energy is actually generated? And while I'm looking up this, where I found proof that it's actually been manufactured.
Well, like you said, that there could have been a hydraulic aspect with the hydraulic ram pump, so there's potential there. How I see the power was generated, the key element of generating the power is the stones in the King's chamber in the roof structure are acoustically tuned. Each stone was cut, ring at a certain frequency, not a different frequency. Each one, what we have, information we have, and we don't know it's exactly true, is it around 440 hertz. It'd be nice to model
That's
it.
the key of A, isn't it? 440.
What's that?
Isn't that the key of A? Is
Yeah,
A 440?
It is, and a lot of people get hung up on 432, and
right.
no, too. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what exact frequency it was. It's the point that it was tuned to a frequency. Each of those stones, and the effect that you get in that large stone, piezoelectric effect in electronics. I've gone and tried to do the calculations, tried to find someone that has calculated the piezo effect in stone, and I couldn't. All of our equations for piezo effect are for tiny pieces of piezo material, crystals used in radios, crystals used in different time devices. The only, and it's only been lately. It's only been in the last 6 months. Our group has actually Chris Dunn, Robert Vaughter is our acoustic engineer. He's connected with a guy at NASA, Dr. Freund, Freudman Freund, and his research was into piezoelectric effects seen for earthquakes, the earthquake lights. And so we're talking about that type of scale, a huge scale piezoelectric effect. And he doesn't even call it a piezoelectric effect. It's an ionization occurring inside the rock on I'm not even good at describing it. But that's the scale of a mountain. And we presented, or Robert presented to his group, hey, I think this pyramid does what you're saying, and we're still working together with some research there that electrical energy produced by stone, and sandstone is one of the best actually in the granite. And you wouldn't see it that way. We've been trained to think that rock is an insulator. It doesn't produce electricity.
Right.
But in a very large scale, it's a tremendous amount of electricity.
Well, on that note, the ley line that runs from the middle of Tennessee up to just across the Ohio River, right, is cut by the Ohio River. There's a sandstone line that is commonly called the Danube National Forest. And there is absolutely a different energy feeling to that than the rest of the Appalachians. So I personally believe it. There's a cut where I-75 has an S-curve, and it cuts through that. And people there drive incredibly fast and get in a lot of wrecks. It's a huge, huge problem here in Kentucky because they get super energized. And you don't mean to. I mean, you'll find yourself driving it, and you'll look, and you're suddenly going 95, and you do not mean to be. And it's fun, obviously, but it's really, really dangerous. So the paper that I just shared to you guys is about something that's appears to be as old as the pyramid building era, and it may go all the way back. Now, the Great Pit of Zawiyet, el-Aryan, they describe it as a failed pyramid. There are actually two of these pits, at least. The other one is being used by the Egyptian military, and they've just filled it with trash. Okay, so we have really no way of getting. This one's on a base, so you can't get to it. But what we have are the pictures. And here's the unique features of this pit. Aside from being really ancient, it is only lined on the bottom of the pit with stone. The sides are all like regular type soil, right? So it's not tile all the way around. So it couldn't be a big tub of like a pool or something else, because the water would just leak out. In the center of the pit, there is it looks like a sarcophagus, right? But it's not. It's an oval tub. It's way too big for a person. And when they found it, it was covered. The lid was on top. Somebody had to forcibly open the lid. Nothing major was found inside, and it's been since filled with like rock or whatever. Now, leading to this tub is so there's like sandstone all around, and then leading to this is a type of granite in an L-shaped path that goes over and then comes up to the ramp. The ramp goes up at a kind of a lowish incline, like steep enough to where they can have a deep pit, but low enough to where you could maybe wheelbarrow. And then there's a flat place in between. Perhaps it was some kind of transfer. And my proposal. And
you're saying it's constructed. It wasn't naturally.
Right. Right. Exactly. This is all.
It was created this way on purpose.
Trapezoidal, cube-shaped pit. And this tub has this granite pathway leading to it. And the granite obviously has a different property. It's going to be harder and potentially more protective. Now, when you read Chris Dunn's book, he talks about acid and the need to generate an environment for these ions to interact with this piezoelectric effect and this acoustic generation.
Yeah, his theory, and he has some evidence to support that the Queen's chamber was a generator of hydrogen, and when I look at that and consider hydrogen in a plasma state, it's superconductor.
Exactly. And so the production of this, if I understand it correctly, there's the use of hydrochloric acid or some other type of acid. I mean, obviously, we would have to find.
Yeah, he proposed dilute hydrochloric acid and what was it?
Yeah,
it wasn't sulfuric. It was something else.
Potassium jumps into my brain here too.
The point is that
hydrated zinc and hydrochloric acid.
Right, they would need to produce this stuff en masse, and here near to the Great Pyramid complex is a pit with a special path that appears to be designed for the production. It looks to me like an early form of smelting. Now, if it's not for smelting, then what is it for the production of? It may have been for the production of this acid. And why was the lid forcibly closed? And why did they have it at the bottom of this pit? Did they need to suddenly flood the area to dilute the acid in case there was a toxic spill? And was that then transferred to the king's chamber, to that sarcophagus, in which then they would fill it up and there would be some kind of interaction going in there? And I don't know. I mean, I have no idea. I'm not going to propose it's uranium or thorium or something like that, but it appears to be industrial as well, and they're calling it a failed pyramid, but there's no proof. There's never been a body. There are no stones around. How do you fail something as large as a pyramid and there not be a pile of massive amounts of stone?
You know, what you're describing to me, in the steel industry, we call big giant tanks of acid pickle tanks.
And, there you go.
Right, so there's a reason why you put acid in a pit. Okay, you don't elevate acid. That's a bad idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't, because for obvious reasons. What happens if it leaks? And there's vapor concerns and things like that. But these pickle tanks are what they use let's say you're doing forgings and you end up with a scale on the outside of the part. It's just an easy way to get all that kind of crud off of your part, and they drop them in these pickle tanks. Well, that off gassing. We handle it through tunnels and like with ducted blowers, forced draft blowers and things like that to keep it, because it would create a byproduct that would be deadly. So if they were using that pit, let's say to your premise that it was acid, it makes sense the way it's designed, if it actually was acid, that you would go down to it, because you wouldn't want those vapors and things coming out and seeping along the ground and looking for another deep spot to go into, and that could kill people.
Or getting into your water table, because if they did choose the Giza Plateau because it was a great aquifer, in order so that they could quickly flush any waste out to the Nile, you wouldn't want anything getting out into that is more than just acid, but is something actually really dangerous or could kill a lot of people seeping out of that. So I would think that this pit is a secondary buffer for that, and of course then they could
It's like a surge tank. If something bad happens, it goes here.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's
okay.
exactly what I'm thinking.
That's
I'm
legit.
thinking that the first pit actually went wrong, and they had to build a second pit, or maybe the other pit was for the second Great Pyramid, because they're both almost the same size. It's possible that they built the first Great Pyramid, the smallest one, the Menkaure, that they built it and as a test bed, and then built the other two as twins to dual fire. I mean, we still do that. A lot of power plants have dual towers. It just makes sense that they would have two of these things running at the same time. So perhaps the other pit was for the other pyramid, but the bottom line is that the military over there in Egypt is sitting on it, and they do not allow any form of excavation or exploration of this pit.
It's in a sensitive area.
A little bit mysterious. I'm not saying that it is for sure that the Egyptian government is involved in a plot to hide Tesla's telluric currents. But
I just think they don't realize it's important.
No, they don't realize, and that's why they filled one of them with trash. I mean,
it's so unimportant. We're going to dump our trash.
Well, and as a culture, they're sort of desensitized to a lot of this stuff too, because you can't dig in the ground. Same thing is true in like Israel and stuff. You can't dig a hole without hitting something. These are societies that were built on top of societies that were built on top. So I think a lot of people were just like, man, I'm so over it. Can't I just go to work?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. If it's not Egyptian tourism, then it may not be,
Right.
Because I mean, a lot of this stuff they've been sitting on a lot of this stuff for a while. I expect that they're actually going to open up that tunnel inside the Sphinx for people, because they're trying to get the tourism back, and so they're like releasing more and more of these tombs, and they've been sitting on them for a while, because otherwise there's just suddenly they're doing a really great job, and it could be new 3D exploration or something, but I think that they knew about a lot of things, and then they've just been keeping them under wraps for a while.
The golden rule in show business is always leave them wanting more. So you don't.
There you go.
A lot of it is also understanding the people and culture. It's if your grandfather taught you one thing, you respect your grandfather, and you keep his message going until he's not around anymore.
Yeah, it's funny because that exists in religions. Isn't it funny how everybody is the religion they were born into? Like 95% of the population, but that religion is the one. It's the same thing. You sort of keep those traditions; they become, like traditions. So you keep that kind of stuff alive.
Well, they do respect their elders, and if they say it was this, then it's going to be that until they die. There's no challenge.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to have to build our own, versions and start off miniaturized and get, a little larger and a little larger. And it may not be that the pyramid is how we do it. I mean, it may not be necessary. I mean, have you all seen those pictures of everybody's abuzz about it? Possibly a Tesla tower down there. I guess it's Texas or Arizona or something. Nobody knows what it is.
That company's building.
I've seen it.
Yeah, actually, a news station did a story on it where they drove up to it. That's a company, and that's what they're doing. They've kind of come. There's a web page and everything for it now.
And so they're trying to create a Wardenclyffe. Is that what you're saying that's confirmed?
Yeah, they won't discuss specifically what they're doing, but they did acknowledge that it has something to do with power, generating power.
Yeah. I mean, it's coming. I agree completely with Eric that we are on the cusp of a revolution now. Whether or not we're allowed to do it at first, that may be a little bit difficult. I have my plans.
I think we've had tastes.
Yeah, we've definitely had tastes, and we need to change.
For 20 years, we've had tastes of it, and there's just been no avenue to get it out, because it is related to capitalism, and how are we going to make money on that? And then how's the little guy going to bring something forward? It's very difficult. So someone needs to produce a machine and present it on a large scale so that it's seen by all that this is producing, and then it gets backed. And we're just now into that culture that would accept it, I think, that we can actually broadcast something like that and everyone see it.
Yeah, the internet's
Yeah,
had a lot to do with that.
We're lucky all those bankers and stuff have died. The ones from that time. I mean, who knows what their ultimate motivation was. I guess maybe Tesla failed to convince them of how they would make money, but for certain, that got suppressed for so long, and even RCA throwing things out. But things have changed, I think, since the new millennium. The question is, what can we get declassified?
Well, the funny thing about things like so the thing that's important, right? When I see a new technology or someone starts talking about a new energy or anything like that, my first question is, great, is it repeatable? Right? Can you do it again? And so a lot of this, there's a lot of things that come out that I see white paper, or not white papers, but see articles and stuff on that. I go, yeah, I don't know about that, kind of, because I don't know that it's repeatable. And I have a buddy that's actually a physicist and teaches at MIT. And he admitted to me one time that there's some really strange shit that happens with nickel that they don't necessarily understand yet, but they can't repeat it. It shows up every now and then, but they can't duplicate it. So they're not really sure what's going on. So, anyway, so that's the great thing about these kinds of finds, though. Once they become repeatable, you can't really suppress something that's repeatable, because sooner or later, some person, tooling around in their garage or whatever, is going to come across it and document it. And one of the things that jumps into my mind, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of this technology called a water hammer, and it's an interesting way, basically, of heating water. Using rotary motion instead of having to use a flame or some sort of electric element or whatever, and you can kind of create hot water on demand. And basically, what it's doing is it's using like a chambered resonance inside this little cavity, and you can buy these. This isn't like but this was like not heard of 20 years ago. Okay, everything was done with natural gas and things like that. To be able to use motion to create hot water, really hot water quickly, there's implications for that in industry. But my point is that nobody heated water resonantly until this thing came about. Like it wasn't even in the if you had to heat water for a process, whatever, here's how you do it. You went to the book, you figured out how many BTUs you needed. I need this size boiler, blah 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 blah. That's just sort of how it worked. And that's an institutional knowledge that it's not a matter of people trying to necessarily hide things. It's just that I got to skin this cat. What's the easiest way to do it? Do it the way somebody else did it, maybe improve it a little, and then check the box and move on, right? That's not a conspiracy. That's just the way things kind of work.
Exactly. It's got we've got to separate the things that are actually being actively withheld from the fact that there's just not enough people going into STEM. I mean, and the ones who are going to STEM, look at what the focus is. Clearly, technology and medicine and engineering is really kind of in a short supply.
Yeah.
And the largest number of people, when I meet kids here in the clinic, they say, "Oh, I'm going to be an engineer." I always ask them. Very, very few say electrical or chemical. And that, to me, is a little bit worrisome, because we are, frankly, sitting on 100 years of really great research that hasn't gone anywhere. I mean, you've got people who have discovered lots of interesting ways of doing things, and it needs to be more applied. I went to a hydrology. The USGS merged, a couple of years ago. They merged several. Now it's like a tri-state, so it's like Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky are all one USGS hydrology center. So I went to their meeting, and there was lots of different groups, right? Every bureaucracy and alphabet that you could imagine was presenting the different projects that they had been working on to each other. And it dawned on me, A, this is the first time that they've really met, and B, a lot of these programs that they had done, they needed each other and didn't know it. So they were producing, let's say, acid runoff, oil runoff metrics, and then this guy over here was working on flood plains. And they're different softwares. producing different types of warning systems and models, right? Well, they needed to work together because what if there's a big spill, or what if the flood reaches into like an oil refinery on the Ohio River? You need to know how that's going to spread, not just on a normal highway or in a creek system as we're currently modeling, but with this flood system. So that's just happening. And and then there was a guy who was doing they were doing the bathymetry of the Ohio River, and they primarily work for barges, right? And I'm sitting there going, well, yeah, but we've also got a problem with silting and dams. And here's the question: how is the silting and the dams affecting pollution movement? So to me, it seemed like a cinch that they should be already working together, but these offices had never done that before.
No, they don't. Bureaucracy, especially inside the government, even the military branches. Anecdote. I can remember one time we had I was in Virginia Beach. I was at the Master Jet Base, Oceana, for the Navy, okay? And it got really cold one winter, and we did not have the adequate foul weather gear. Let's just say that, okay? And we ended up making a deal with the Air Force, who had these really cool chem suits, these chemical suits that all the Air Force guys get. So if they get, attacked chemically, they put these they have like charcoal lined suits that they would put on. But the side benefit of these things was they were super warm. And so we were trading the Air Force 55-gallon drums of aircraft cleaner for chem suits, like back and forth. Now, what's ridiculous about that is we couldn't requisition foul weather gear. We couldn't get it, right? But we're all in the military. So there's an Air Force squadron or an Air Force base that has like tons of these just sitting around in boxes that they just don't have nothing to do with. Okay? But because like I said, even inside the branches of the military, they don't talk to each other. So it was like, look, we couldn't requisition that from another branch of the military. We had to like make backroom deals with stuff we could get that they couldn't get for whatever reason, and make these swaps and running pickup trucks and stuff back between our bases to make this thing happen. It's ridiculous. No. Pregnant pause. I'll have to cut that out. Shit.
We don't have any experiences related.
No, I was DOD, so don't have that kind of angst.
12.
No, I mean it's a different experience as a civilian. I know that you're all like don't treat me like I'm super special, but I treat veterans all day, and I do have to say, thank you, all of you guys for doing it. Because I mean, as a civilian working DOD, it's kind of like I'm guaranteed to go home. That's not. I mean, unless I get hit on the highway, So I didn't have to worry, and so. To me, it's just marvelous that there are people that serve, whether they see combat or not. To me, it's I get a lot in here, and they have disabilities, but they didn't get it, doing combat. Sometimes they were doing training, and
yeah,
sometimes they were driving a Jeep on the base, something like that, got in a car wreck. But to me, it's all really great. The amount of there's never been a military from my Art of War background. I'll tell you this: there's never been a military in the world that used ships to go and provide hospital service to hurricane victims. That's just never been a thing.
Yeah, it's kind of a unique. Well, the aircraft carrier was a uniquely American thing for a long time too, right? We were the ones with the audacity to pull it off.
Well, there's a lot of things that our military does that really are just outstanding in terms of engineering a new solution that has never been done before. People need to remember, if they get hard on our military, not only do we have laws or rules of engagement, right, that we prosecute, but the fact is that for thousands of years, some city-states' entire economy was nothing but pillaging. Like they didn't have mines, and they weren't. They might have had bars, I guess, and brothels, but they didn't have a real economy. So they would just go and invade someone else, And the fact that we have a military that is involved in the sciences, I mean, I wish that they weren't involved in, wasteful types of science. But how could they know, right? Because they're bean counters, and they're being told, oh, we're going to find dark energy. Well, It has been the most inefficient way of us discovering the electric universe, but I guess we're going to continue in that direction. I've put out 6 of these papers in reply to the dark matter issue, and man, they're not finding any of that stuff. They're not finding axions. They're not finding WIMPs, machos.
Right.
I mean, they're finding machos in the sky. They're just not connected to dark matter. So we are at a place where we're going to start really seeing the truth about these plasma electromagnetic anomalies, from ball lightning and sprites all the way up to comets. I mean, they just released that picture of Ultima Thule, and it looked exactly how Walt Thornhill predicted, because the double lobe nature is not an accident of 2 asteroids clashing together. It is the rule of the cometary electric shaping that happens in the solar wind. The solar wind interacts with the charged body, and it forms, like, one end is positive and one end is negative. It's really quite simple, but for us it seems to be some kind of huge mystery. And we're still stuck on the accretion. You'll meet people that they're still fully into accretion. But if you actually go and look, these trans-Neptunian objects, they have families, and they're all in different planes of orbit. So, this solar system was not accreting, and we are just discovering how things are really working together. They put out a new image for Saturn now that Cassini has put back all his data, and the core is no longer, like kind of a blasé core. It's a liquid metallic hydrogen core. And there is really interesting stuff going on. Some people even think the center of the Earth might be liquid metallic hydrogen. I just go with some kind of like a HHO or some kind of form of water that then gets modified as it comes through the mantle. But certainly something interesting is going on, and we can utilize that if we want. It's all about if we want. I mean, we could also argue about Twitter tweets and the politics all day long, but there's something that can be done. There's real work, I guess you would say. Is Tesla, he called it increasing human momentum and human energy, like coming to a place where we're actually going forward and accomplishing something. And that's what I'm really excited about.
We got to see if I can segue this, because one of the things that Eric was talking about a little bit ago with your experience with energy weapons was creating these plasma tubes that you can actually create through space, right? You can and then in that you can transmit electricity or power. Wouldn't that be impervious to mass coronal ejections and things like that our existing power grid is super susceptible to? Wouldn't that be less susceptible to that, or am I wrong about that?
I just know the concept that you can produce an ionized column to the ionosphere with a laser if you form that laser into a cylinder of light. And light within is ionized. I can't speak to the topic you just brought up there.
It was something that kind of passed through my mind, because there's and Shifu and I have talked about this. We talked about it here today, how woefully underprepared our existing power grid and system is for these types of events. And I mean, we don't know when it's going to happen. We just know it is, because it's happened in the past many times, right?
It's already happening. The satellites, they've made the mistake of assuming that the magnetosphere, when they started launching satellites in the 70s, they made the mistake of assuming the magnetosphere was going to be there, and it's not. And what they're finding is some of these satellites are starting to get fried because they are existing a little further out in the magnetosphere, and it doesn't take much. It's just like basically an A-class solar flare direct hit, and that whole side of the Earth, those outer satellites can go down.
What was it, a couple of weeks ago? There were some transformers that exploded.
Yeah, in Europe.
Well, it was in the U.S. It was, I'm going to get this wrong, like Oklahoma and then somewhere in the East Coast.
Yeah, New York City. There was a bunch of videos out about it, making the sky glow. Yep.
I saw those videos, and in the videos, there's a blue line going up from the transformer, and they're saying, look, it's a directed energy weapon. No, it's not. It's the response of the camera in your phone with that much light. But I did hear a report where those transformer explosions and the date that it happened in two separate locations, greatly separated, but there was a match to mass coronal ejection from the sun, and it timed up just perfectly that it just happened to discharge in those two locations.
Exactly.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how many ghosts in the machine we're chasing, so to speak, that is because we're just not measuring this and correlating that information.
Yeah, you're going to get the weak points first. Those two nodes must have been the weak points where something combined.
Yeah.
Well, it was probably, I don't know if you guys remember in your electrical engineering training, but the Dirac delta function. When you flip a switch on, let's say like in the early days of the microwave, you would turn on the microwave, and that cyclotron in there would cause a current spike. And in a large number of households, that current spike would actually flip the circuit breaker in the house. We actually had one because we had an older circuit breaker in the house, and we got one of these microwaves that had been around like already 10 years. And this was already 10 years ago, so this is now, we're talking a 20 to 30-year-old microwave. And it would probably every, like, let's say fifth or sixth time, it would flip the circuit breaker. And that's because of there's something to do with when you first make that connection, there's a spike that tends towards infinity. It doesn't reach infinity because that would be an infinite current draw. And it does it in a very, very short period of time.
Yeah, it
so
tries.
I imagine that it is what they're calling it magnetic reconnection, which is a really bad term, right? Because magnetism doesn't disconnect. But there is something happening where there's a coupling of Earth spots and solar flare activity, and it's directing. They call them magnetic tunnels or flux magnetic ropes, and it's directing the energy as a surge down right onto those grids. And probably, it's just finding, it could be older or corroded parts in the grid, or it could be that there's too much load already in that on that area of the circuit, and it just, that spike, it goes past, and it just boom, nails it. And the old days, and Eric Dollard goes over this in his stuff. People can go to ericdollard.com or Eric P. Dollard or something like that, and then Crystal Radio Initiative. He's actually been trying to dig up some of the telegraph equipment, because the old telegraphs, not only could they catch fire from these solar flares, the wires would catch fire, but they also would start getting these long waves showing up in their telegraph equipment that were predicting earthquakes. So he's been doing research to try and find the long waves that predict earthquakes hours and hours ahead.
Yeah, this is an issue even in industry. We call it transients, and because everybody's power is connected to each other. So there's a certain what would you call it? A standard for what kind of noise you can actually induce on a power line now, because you're sending it to your neighbor too. And these transients, when they get rectified or they get transformed through transformers, they get amplified, and different weird stuff happens to them, and we're blowing equipment up, expensive stuff, electronic type stuff in factories and stuff now. So this, like I said, so now there's like these standards where how much noise you can actually put back up on the grid before the power plant, or the utility in this case, right, would say you can't connect to us because you're polluting the power source to all these other places. And this has been within the last not even 10 years, I would say, that we've really started looking at this. But things like personal computers and a lot of different type of electronics devices, especially the ones that rectify to DC and have clocks and all kinds of stuff like that in it. These all put noise onto the utility. So everybody's getting like really shitty power now. And these transients that ride on top of the power will go into your house or go into your business or whatever, and will blow things up. We'll cook now they blow them up in the sense that they just turn off. They stop functioning because they can jump over like insulative barriers and stuff in standard electronics. So I can't even imagine what a transient induced from like a solar flare would look like. It would hit like a sledgehammer. It'd be
Well,
massive.
this is reminding me. I'm sorry, Eric. Were you going to say something?
No,
Oh.
it's reminding me of, I think it was Dollard talking about experiments and going outside and the telephone poles were shaking and, oh, we better shut that down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Generating a little bit of electromotive force in those wires.
Yeah, and the reports of Tesla, he blew up a power station, which Westinghouse didn't like that. That was
Yeah,
one
'cause,
of the
Well,
nails in
that's
his coffin.
that's the problem with small-minded men like Westinghouse having so much money. He should have been excited. He should have been like, "Wow, I could weapon
Yeah,
like that."
that far away, he produced enough feedback to blow a power station.
yeah.
Yeah, I
Like,
mean,
let's figure that out.
that guy wasn't thinking forward, but he'd already made his money, I suppose. So this sort of actually segues, if you want, into, it's super speculative, okay, into this paper. But as I was writing about the new religion, right? So I don't want to go into that, but I was talking about the need to create something that people can see and feel, that's tangible and real and worthy of worship, right? Because like the television is everywhere, but it's not worthy of worship, right? And the cell phone, the smartphone, is definitely something that people. I personally stopped this woman had gotten in a wreck on the I-75, and we pulled her out of the car and we're waiting, and it's raining, and all she could worry about was her phone. We handed her that phone, and she hugged it like it was a baby. I mean, I kid you not. She hugged her iPhone like it was a child. So the question is, what can we generate that would be actually worthy of that kind of worship? And my idea is what I'm calling them Birkeland. What was it? Birkeland polyphase superweb. So if you can follow the words, the Birkeland being Birkeland currents. So we're talking about transferring energy through these, whether we're using lasers, masers, through ion cylinders, or twisting plasma streams through the ionosphere. Something that we could see that would actually give us kind of the Northern Lights effect. And then polyphase meaning multiple channels doing different things. You have power, you have transfer of communications, you have entertainment, all that kind of stuff could be done through it. And also interacting with the Earth, generation from coupling with the Earth. And then the superweb, implying here that actually we would be capable with that kind of throughput to run quantum supercomputers in tandem. So the same way that like Google does with semiconductor computers, right, where they parallel them, and they're running, and they can use their computer to create the Google AI. And the Google AI is pretty smart. I mean, it's now beat all the Go champions, right? It's getting up there in intelligence. Well, imagine creating one that works and was naturally, organically working, right? From emergent properties, it actually was programmed itself, right? It emerges from the property of complex interweb of these quantum computers working together and sharing information back and forth. Imagine the things we could simulate. You got a person with a certain type of cancer, and you scan them, and you get all that scan data, and you put it in, and it starts proposing solutions for that person's cure. And then if you can't cure it, it starts helping you to think through ways of actually curing the person. So a form of energy or electrical and light transfer that isn't just going to your computer and giving you, the daily news, but actually that you can yourself touch and feel, the way Tesla did when he sat in the room and glowed, and then he held a light bulb and it glowed. That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And I propose that it would actually be self-protective. It wouldn't be impervious, but it would be certainly mutually protective. And it may be capable of generating the kind of electricity that we need through, harnessing the solar wind, and maybe even having to harness Jupiter to actually terraform Mars and Venus, or create space stations that don't require plutonium or uranium reactors, but are actually really safe because they're just receiving, and maybe even have individual magnetospheres around them, like plasma sheaths, because you can create in the lab in Project Sapphire, they created a plasma sheath around their first anode, the small version, the star of the jar. It was 15 layers thick. So it's possible for us to create these plasma double layers as a way of protecting our astronauts. That's the kind of stuff that I'm interested in.
The two things come to mind, though, when you talk about, and I get where you're coming from because this is emergent. I mean, it's all, like you said, it's already happening, and it's happening bigger and bigger all the time. And I'm specifically talking about like co-processing and sharing. I mean, what was it? The SETI has been doing that for years, right? You can set your screensavers, like an application where you could donate time, CPU calculation time of your computer to SETI, right? Is that what, search for extraterrestrial life, right?
Yeah. You're right.
But the thing that comes, there's two things that kind of jump into my head, and they both come from Elon Musk, and who's terrified of AI, and says we got to be very careful with it, right? But he's also the guy that has that company NeuroNet that's tying computers into people. Right, that's supposed to. He made that announcement not too long ago. That's supposed to be coming out this year.
It's kind of overdue.
Yeah, So
from his announcement.
But isn't the fear? The fear is all the same. It's that we're going to create something super intelligent, and it's going to realize that we're the problem. It's like there's a fear to that.
We're all no, because if you think like that, then why doesn't Mother Nature just kill us all today? I mean, there's a famous saying in Chinese is that heaven and earth are loveless so much that they give even robbers and criminals food and water. So from the perspective of the universe, it's a polar mind. It's not dual. It's polar. So being polar, it's going to see that we're both a problem and a solution. That's one. Right. I mean, the second thing is that being an emergent natural AI. Right, it governs itself. It would work with us, but it isn't going to obey us like a slave. And also, AI. The real fear of AI is that currently all those AI that are being created are created by humans, and therefore they can have agendas. They've already shown this. There was that work. The Crowder. He was asking the Google Assistant about Jesus, and it wouldn't answer about Jesus. It would answer about everybody else, and that means that somebody had programmed the Alexa and the Google and the Google Assistant to not answer that question.
Yeah, they put a bias in it. Well, it's not necessarily for nefarious reasons. It could be because they didn't want to insult anybody either, per se. But I get what you're saying.
I leave it up to the
right.
person who
the
sees
fear. The fear you're talking about. The fear is that AI is going to be programmed by humans. Well, we are humans, and who's programming us? It's other humans.
For real.
No, that's a good point.
And maybe the same problems.
Yeah, and I think that's the fear that people like. Okay, so there again, because people have most people have kind of a fatalistic view, myself not excluded, but that's the thing. They see that okay, humans are the ones programming in this, and we know how dark humans can be. So that's sort of the focus. That's where the fear comes from.
Oh,
right?
I definitely agree with that as a problem, but they're going to do it anyways. Here, Elon Musk, he can talk about it, but he's going to put in self-driving cars, and those self-driving cars, the reason they love these self-driving cars is because of the computational power each one contains. All right, the Internet of Things is coming, either this year or in 10 years or in 100 years, but it's going to happen. So the question is, can we create a version that serves us? Imagine having a computer that looks and feels and even filters your house like a tree, and that tree has a name, and you can interact with it on some level, and it has a feeling, and it creates an ambiance in your home, and it provides water filtration in your home, and it connects you to a power grid, and that power grid is out running. It's up in space. You can walk out your door. You can look up and see it. You can go get on a lack of a better word, a rocket ship, which is launched by electromagnets, which the designs have existed since the 80s. And you can go visit another planet, which we are then, using the electromagnetic force to transfer carbon dioxide back from Venus to Mars, where it had originally come from in the first place, according to the ancients. So, you can terraform Mars and stay there or go anywhere. I mean, there's no reason we can't do it, except that we've created an economic system that's based on lack. And there are new economic systems. Japan is trying to create, it's like 6 different forms of currency, which, as they interact, can actually buffer against some of the problems that booms and busts in capitalism create. But the real issue to me is we should have so much energy, and it should be so abundant that even after the end of the day, because you're going to have to pay for the insurance and the upkeep and the maintenance and the serviceman to come and keep your home power plant running. At the end of the day, those companies, they make so much money that it wouldn't be so much energy to then crank out a 3D printed set of clothes for a homeless person. Right? That's the kind of possibilities that cheap energy can provide.
Right.
I mean, I don't want to feed people gruel, but I imagine that there's a way to make sugary foods or things that come from plants, or the fibers of plants even, and to refine them into food that then could feed truly homeless or refugees or whatever.
Yeah, you solve the power problem. You solve almost every. I've beat this drum, and it's like nobody. Sometimes I feel like I'm beating my head against a wall. It's like, look, guys, folks, this is how it works. Okay, automation makes things, and so the concepts of the way we sort of fit ourselves into this society with how we work and doing jobs and things. This is all going away. And we got to get ready for that, because you're going to come to a point where if we could solve the power problem, we can solve the water problem in California. We can desalinize water. We know how to do that. We know how to grow food indoors. We know we
could pay with the California thing. Here's the cool part. You could be running desalination plants that also are filtration plants to clean out the oceans and beaches again, while simultaneously providing wireless electricity to AI robots which go along the desert and dig bioswales, which then fill up with water and recharge the desert. The desert slowly changes into a living biosphere, and the entire Sacramento Valley could be a city if you wanted.
It's been a huge paradigm change for me, because I've always been of the more, I guess you would call it, conservative side of the spectrum, where it come down to things like, what do you call it, universal basic income. Okay. Until I really started looking at this automation issue and sort of how technology is increasing and things are happening, I never would have ever considered something like that. But I'm sort of at a point where, again, if we could solve this freaking power issue, things like universal basic income, stuff like that, because what else are people going to do? We are going to reach a point where there's just not enough things for people to do. So then what happens? Right? I mean, what's the next phase there? So, like I said, I've started kind of looking at things much differently. Not that I'm a big fan of it, or I'm out saying, hey, this is what we got to do. But like you said, there comes a point where things like housing, clothing, your basic material needs can be met for like next to nothing, cost-wise. So why shouldn't we do that? Or,
Well, it's going to happen. It's just whether or not people with hearts and minds are going to guide it, or if you're going to have fascists guide it. Because people who, whether they're Bilderbergers or Trilateral Commission they see the world like a chess game, and for them there is only to win, right? And so they create a zero-sum game. Well, us common people, we're raising families. We got businesses. We have dreams. We have ideas. We're not here. I mean, I don't personally want to control a billion people. They're worried about how to control those people. They're worried about how to inoculate those people. What I'm worried about is, how do we make sure that people actually make it through? I don't like to ever see any teenager think that they have no place in this world in their life. I don't like to see any veteran get out of the military and go through that. we should have machines that can flush all of those charges and move the neurochemistry in a way to at least open them up to where they start considering. Because the brain, once you get it clear of a negative state, it will seek a solution, and intuitively it will find new solutions. And when it finds new solutions, those people they'll find a purpose, and they'll eventually they'll go and
right.
I don't know, they'll become a park ranger. If they got nothing else to do, they could become a park ranger and just be around nature. And there is a way to sustain those 8 to 11 billion people, but it's not going to be on it's not even going to be on cow farts. I'm telling you, there's enough methane in the earth that we could really, we could go for a long time, but it's not the right way to go about it.
It's still burning something.
Except for Lake Victoria, because we definitely got to get the methane out of the methane and all those gases out of those lakes, because if it comes out, it's going to kill huge amounts of people. So we've got to mine that, but we don't need to do it in a way that. And I'm not super anti-fracking, but I'm just saying that we've got to do it in a way that's responsible for the water table, because amphibians and fish, they need certain pH levels, right? We can filter our water for our drinking, but what's the frog going to do? What's the giant salamander going to do? We've got to do better.
There's more to it than that, right?
We can do better. We can reforest all of Borneo. There's a guy who's actually done a small amount of it, and the benefits have been astronomical. So we can actually do it, but you need to have energy to provide it. So and who's going to be doing the airdrop of the seeds? Now we could pay a pilot, but there's a pilot shortage. So what about these AI guided solar airplanes
and drones and things like that, right?
Load them up with seeds, and let them reseed Borneo, let them reseed Iceland, wherever it is. We can do it. We could save the elephant and the rhino if we're willing to reintroduce them here in America, but we're not going to do it using old systems, because those old systems, they were based around ideas. Well, they were very me-centered ideas. This is my ranch. I'm going to put this fence up. I don't want any buffaloes interfering with my cattle. But it's all like, even the way we manage forests is based on this idea like we have to keep it perfect. Well, keeping it perfect is actually leading towards problems. That's how you kill Yellowstone in the 1800s, and what we've got to do is work with nature. And that's where I love all these life sciences, and then more modernly, the permaculture and gray water technology and aquaponics. They all want to work with how the system naturally works, which is how the TED conference in general has been centered around, is this idea of new design. But what they're not talking about is what we're talking about. Where are you going to power it, and where's the money going to come from?
Exactly.
And so we need a way that the power continuously generates new revenues, and those new revenues generate more research.
Right.
Research generates more product, and the product meaning to help people. And it's my maintenance that the Giza power plant was an early version of this, and it was meant to help the people. I doubt it was a monolith to a king. I really do. And I don't think it was there to crush slaves. And I think that it was holy, but it was holy in the way of, wow, this provides our entire life. Look at the abundance that we've created. Look at the aquifers and how we work with it.
Holistic.
And I think it was just cut short. Of course, humanity blamed itself. All around the world, we blamed ourselves. But I don't think that we need to anymore.
Well, coming full circle here, we've been at like 2 hours and 15 minutes.
I know my family got here for giving me a treatment.
Hey, Eric, when you guys are finishing up the stuff that you're working on with Chris right now, right? And there will be something that will be released after that sort of wraps that up, or how's that going to work?
We're having a tour in March 3rd. You can go to gizapower.com and look at Chris's tour, and there's still time to get in on that. We're going to release some new information on what we've discovered, and what I'm looking to do by the end of this month, by the 31st, I have to write a paper for AIAA. I don't know if you're familiar.
No, I'm not.
American Astronautics and Aeronautics. I'm actually putting together a paper with work that I've seen related to Giza power plant, a link with Giza power plant with work at NASA and work at Purdue, and presenting it to AIAA. And that'll be presented in August, actually. Rolls-Royce is hosting the AIAA this year in Indianapolis.
Are those public? Like, is that paper going to be published anywhere?
That'll be published, yeah, public paper through the AIAA.
And is the conference, is that open to the public, or is that only aeronautics engineers, or what?
You have to be a member.
But
anyone can be a member.
Right.
I'm calling up the data on that. But yeah, so Chris is actually working on another book. So part of what I find goes into that book. And then with my paper, I'll just be reinforcing his work as a testimony that, hey, what Chris Dunn said 20 years ago is right. Here's some more detail of how it would have worked. Is that the question you were asking?
No, I just kind of want to get a sense for what's coming up, because it sounds to me like we may have to do a deep dive together, especially after this paper is released, where we go back into this. I'd like to revisit this, because this is one of them things that, when I looked at the data, I was the same way. I was like, man, I think these guys are onto something here. Like, this makes sense to me. And whether it's intentional or not, I don't know. And I would really like to understand it better, though, because there was some really cool stuff going on there.
Well, those papers that I had posted are a great primer for your audience, because it's one thing, people have unfortunately, gone after Chris, and whether they were like pro hydrology or just mainstream, and what they don't realize is how intelligent Chris is and how he approaches it, just like an investigative journalist.
He's very clinical about it, yeah.
Right, but instead of an investigative journalist such as Graham Hancock, it's a guy who's an engineer and a machinist, and so he knows what he's looking at, and he can break it down for you. And now you've got papers that show the electromagnetic behaviors in the pyramids, and you've got pits that are clearly industrial related. And when you combine all that together, it paints a very different picture. I mean, there's stuff that Eric has told me that we've even gone over, stuff that is like mind blowing. You're sitting there going, how is that even possible for the era? But that's because we're so used to seeing the world in that linear way of everything developing, but it may have just been developing because of the cataclysms, right? I mean, it could be that they were very advanced and in several places around the world. I mean, one of the papers I was looking at, it had the mathematical calculations. We're talking 2,000 meter mega tsunamis, man. So, there is a lot of stuff that could have been washed away. And luckily for us, the pyramids being really strong, they've lasted the time, and the engineering there is just unreal. People need to stop associating with tombs. It's way too well engineered for a tomb.
Yeah, that's over. And I think even the culture in Egypt has realized that. I mean, when we go for our presentations, there's separate groups that have contacted us from within Egypt. Hey, will you stop by and talk with us? And we didn't even realize that there's like these factions of engineering folks within Egypt, Egyptians, that say, we see what you're doing, and we agree.
Well,
we're probably going to find that the Middle East supports these efforts because they know that oil isn't forever, and I'm sure they're going to love to keep their supercars, right? Well, so they're going to be interested in this kind of power.
I think there's another piece to this, guys, and I think it's the same thing that's happening in South America, because when these so there's going to be people that are going to look at this and go, our culture was a lot richer, smart, richer, not in the monetary sense, but that as well. But there was a lot more going on here from our ancestors than we realize, and
right.
And that is an empowering thing to a culture, not a bad thing. So I think just naturally anybody wants to put their flag down, right, and say that these are my people, kind of thing. So it makes sense that if enough people start to kind of understand this data and look at it this way, that they're gonna get very, very interested in it and want to pursue that.
Absolutely. I mean, look, I work at Rolls-Royce with some of the best engineers in the world, and there's things that I come upon with the Giza power plant, and am I really seeing this in this structure? And I take that over to fellow engineers, and they're like, at first, just like me, no way. And then the next day, it's absolutely what that is.
Yeah.
And then we give it to another engineer and another and another and another. Then you've got this clan of 15 to 20 engineers that say, oh, yeah, that's a power plant.
Yeah, it's scary. Well, maybe we should do, I don't know. I mean, we'll start wrapping up here, guys. But maybe we should do like a part 2 to this, where we take a much deeper dive into those facts or those pieces of that puzzle that explains why this is a power plant, or why this was some sort of
that
device.
would be amazing, because we could cover the machining and all sorts of stuff, the various proofs. We could create kind of a list for people, and I expect by that the rate things are accelerating. I'm expecting there to be a lot of changes between now and April. I'm not even kidding you when it seems like every day there is something even more amazing than the previous day in terms of discoveries. So, I mean, I know Eric's got a few gems he's withholding, and I can't wait till he drops those bombs, man. I'm telling you, the bombs that we haven't dropped are basically as good as the bombs we already have dropped. So, well, Eric, I look forward to it.
If you're down for it, Eric, I would love to kind of do that. I mean, this was kind of a way to kind of get you, welcome to the podcast and the audience and stuff like that. But okay, well, let's make that happen then. I mean, I guess timing is up to you. When you're ready to kind of start releasing publicly. And my studio is available for, you guys whenever you want it. It's, just let me know and I hit the record button so we can make that happen. So cool. Is anything else? I mean, what I want you to do is once we're done here, Eric, is, I'll have you send me links and stuff. That's things that you want me to put in the description for links to the websites. And I've got the links to the papers and stuff, Shifu, that you sent over to me. So I'll make sure those will get in there for the audience. So if you want to download these papers, guys, I'm going to put links and everything out there for you so you can kind of go see what these guys are talking about. But is there anything else we need to cover before we wrap up?
No, it's all good. I'm sending you some more people.
Oh, man, thanks. That's been awesome.
If we get a discussion after the tour, I'll try to get Chris in. He's too close to me to not include.
Well, guys, I'm not actually that. I mean, I'm hours away from you myself. If you want to do a in the studio on the good mics kind of thing, let me know. I can make that happen. I mean, we're all within driving distance of each other.
Yeah, I'd love to do that, because I got to go back up to the Great Serpent Mound. I have a number of. So I've found some thunderbolts, as you are aware of. I've found actual sites. So I'm going to be taking EMF measurements. At both the magnetic and electric field measurements here at the mound in Lexington, as well as the big Thunderbolt strike site near Lexington.
Yep.
And then I'm going to be going to up to Serpent Mound sometime this year and actually doing measurements there. So it'd be a good excuse for me to do both.
Perfect.
One trip, that'd be awesome.
No, I'm the megaphone, guys. Yeah. When you're ready to announce it, let me know and we'll turn it on. Okay. I mean, I'm real excited, man. I'm so glad you guys took the time. Eric, it's been wonderful talking with you, meeting you, and I'm looking forward to doing this again with you and continuing to explore this, because again, this is a topic that just fascinates the shit out of me, because it's such a big paradigm change. From accepted, and anything that does that, like Rick was the same way, Shifu, I love having those kinds of people on that are really challenging paradigms and bending paradigms and things like that. So consider me sold and ready to do this again whenever.
Cool.
Thank you, Matt.
No problem.
Appreciate it.
We'll wrap up there, folks. Thanks for listening. Check us out, www.noshitcast.com, KNOWSHITCAST.com for all of your podcasting needs. Thanks for all the likes and subscribes out there, folks. The show's still growing like mad, and I really appreciate it. And keep sharing us, keep sending those questions. Shifu, keep sending me those guests, buddy. It's been wonderful. And we'll wrap up here, and we'll catch you all next time. Thanks, everyone. Bye. That's how we do it.